In 2023, the entire continent of Africa accounted for roughly 3% of global trade. 3%. A continent of 1.4 billion people, rich in resources, bursting with ambition, and only 15% of its exports stay within the continent itself. Europe internally trades at 69%, Asia at 59%. A product made in China can reach Lagos faster than goods from a neighboring African country. So what's going on, and is it finally changing? Part 1. The Colonial Blueprint. To understand Africa's trade patterns today, you have to go back to Berlin, November 1884. 14 European nations divided the African continent among themselves. No African leader was in the room. What they built or chose not to build is what matters most. Colonial railways, roads, and ports had one purpose: extraction. They connected mines and farms to coastlines. They faced Europe, not each other. The Uganda Railway ran from Mombasa port into the interior. The Congo-Ocean Railway connected mining regions to the Atlantic. Every line pointed outward. None connected neighboring African economies to one another. Colonial powers also deliberately suppressed African manufacturing. Territories were required to export raw materials and import finished goods from Europe. Local industries that might compete were discouraged or banned outright. When 17 countries gained independence in 1960 alone, they inherited these systems almost entirely intact. The railways still ran to the ports, the trade still flowed outward. Then came the Cold War and the debt crises of the 1980s. IMF structural adjustment programs opened African markets to global competition before local industries were ready to compete. Manufacturing collapsed in many countries. Africa's manufacturing share of GDP fell from 18% in the 1970s to roughly 10% today. A continent wired for export to Europe, not internal exchange, and then structurally prevented from rewiring itself. Part 2. The Three Barriers. Today, three major barriers keep intra-African trade low. First, infrastructure. Less than a quarter of Africa's roads are paved. Transport costs account for 30 to 50% of the final price of traded goods, compared to under 10% in Europe. Trucks at the Bait Bridge crossing between Zimbabwe and South Africa routinely wait 2 to 4 days. Fresh produce rots in border queues. Ports like Lagos sit congested for weeks at a time. Railway lines use incompatible gauges. Trains from one country literally cannot run on another country's tracks. Every unpaved road, every broken bridge, every mismatched rail gauge is a tax on trade, and that tax falls hardest on the smallest businesses. Second, similar economies. Many African countries produce the same things: oil, cocoa, raw agricultural commodities. Nigeria and Angola both export oil. Ivory Coast and Ghana together supply 2/3 of the world's cocoa, but almost none of it is processed in Africa. It leaves as raw beans, gets made into chocolate in Europe, and some of that chocolate is sold back to African markets. When your neighbors produce the same things you do, there's nothing to trade with each other. Regions that trade heavily within themselves, like East Asia, have complementary economies. One country makes the components, another assembles them, another ships the product. They need each other. Much of Africa doesn't yet have that industrial diversity. Third, the paperwork. Tariffs, inconsistent customs rules, and documentation requirements that change at every border make cross-border trade a bureaucratic obstacle course. Some trade corridors have historically required over 1,600 separate documents. Trucks sit for days at checkpoints not because of the goods, but because of the thorns. Non-tariff barriers now cost more than tariffs themselves, and for small informal traders, who account for an estimated 30 to 40% of all intra-African trade, these barriers are often effectively prohibitive. The result is rational but damaging. Businesses import from large global suppliers because it's simply easier than trading with their neighbors. Part 3. What's changing? Here's where things get genuinely interesting, because for the first time in a long time, there are real, concrete reasons for optimism. The African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA, entered into force in 2019.
It aims to connect 54 countries and 1.4 billion people into a single market, the largest free trade area in the world by number of countries. The goal is to eliminate tariffs on 90% of traded goods, harmonize customs procedures, and build the conditions for regional supply chains to form. If fully implemented, the World Bank projects it could lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty by 2035 and add $450 billion to the continent's collective income. Implementation has been uneven. COVID disrupted momentum. Some countries have been slow to submit their commitments, but the framework exists, the Secretariat is working, and pilot trade flows have already begun between member states. Meanwhile, Africa has already proven it can leapfrog conventional development paths. M-Pesa launched mobile money in Kenya in 2007 and spread across the continent faster than conventional banking ever reached rural areas. Africa now holds over 50% of the world's mobile money accounts. Fintech companies are building cross-border payment systems that allow direct currency transactions between African nations, cutting out dollar conversion costs and making trade viable for smaller businesses. And in the East African community, it's already working. Regional trade has grown from $1.5 billion in 2000 to over $10 billion today. One-stop border posts have cut crossing times from days to hours. The northern corridor from Mombasa through Kenya, Uganda, and into Rwanda is functioning, not perfectly, but measurably better. The proof of concept is real. Conclusion: Africa's limited internal trade isn't an accident of geography. It's the accumulated result of deliberate historical choices. Colonial infrastructure designed for extraction, economic structures never reformed, trade systems that kept pointing outward. But structures built by humans can be rebuilt by humans. The AfCFTA exists. Regional institutions are more developed than at any point since independence. The digital infrastructure to reduce trade friction is being built in real time. And there is, across Africa's business and policy communities, a clearer understanding of the structural problems and a clearer commitment to solving them than has existed before. The 30 million people the World Bank says could be lifted out of poverty if the AfCFTA works, those are real people in real places whose lives would look different if they could trade more freely with their neighbors. A continent of 1.4 billion people, the youngest population on Earth, enormous natural wealth, and a trade agreement that, if it works, would finally let Africa trade with itself. That's not a small thing. That's a continent coming into its own.